This side just move them all to the side. They did last time.
I'm sorry. I know where I was lowering that.
No, microphones, that little hiss
Yeah.
I think it's just the AC blowing on mics, because as I turn these off, it disappears. But I don't think it's line hiss. It's nothing broken. So I think it may just be the gentle blowing of the air. As it blowing, I feel from the vents like here. I think that's what it is. It's just a soft. There's nothing game breaking. It's just a little hiss to the sound there.
Center.
Earlier, and it was just
Hey, can you try a mic for a second?
Try the exact same one that I was using earlier.
Mic check. 1, 2.
Okay. Huh. We're just not hearing the ones up there. Let me give that one more go because I think that gentleman over there is responsible for it. So the two mics I'm going to be using for the chairman and the CEO here.
That's good.
Mic check. 1, 2. Mic check. 1, 2.
Hey, can you give me a mic check again real quick?
Yeah.
Mic check. 1, 2. Normal.
See, I'm not getting anything online.
Oh, they gotta be like actively talking when they like that.
They just did, and I heard it on mine. Yes.
afternoon. Glad to see everyone here, both here in person and joining by phone. As you know, we're here to provide an update on grid conditions going into this winter. Recently, ERCOT released its winter SARA report. Our new CEO, Pablo, will discuss the details of that here in a minute. But out of the gates, I want to remind folks about all of the reforms that we have put in place, especially ahead of last winter when we rapidly put in new rules to require generators to weatherize. We followed that by inspections of generators across the ERCOT grid. In addition, we've built out and mapped a critical supply chain and critical infrastructure network to make sure that the natural gas supply chain stays online at all times and ensures the gas continues to flow to our generators. And most importantly, we have dramatically increased and improved communication between the Railroad Commission, TxDOT, TDEM, TCEQ, the PUC, and ERCOT. And we saw the benefits of that improved coordination and communication last winter at the State Operations Center when TURC worked hand in hand across agencies, across industries to ensure that during the winter blasts of February, we had adequate gas. We had generators that were online when we needed them to be online. TxDOT was on standby to make sure that roads were cleared to ensure reliable power throughout the winter. Going into this winter, we're even better prepared. We've put even stricter weatherization standards in place this fall. ERCOT will continue to inspect and increase its inspections of generators. And importantly, for the first time ever, ERCOT has developed and implemented a new firm fuel product that guarantees that we have almost 3,000 megawatts of firm fuel supplies to bolster and enhance our grid going into this winter. We're better prepared than ever. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Pablo to discuss the SARA.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'd just like to reiterate a key point here. Because of the changes that have been initiated by the legislature and the administration, and because of the actions taken by the PUCT and ERCOT over the last year and a half, we are in a position where the elements that are within our control related to the reliability and the operation of the grid are as strong as they've ever been going into this winter season. And the chairman has mentioned many of those items, and I'll add to that the scheduling of outages and the maintenance periods that we talked about a little bit a couple months ago. Those continue to help to ensure that we get the required maintenance on generators so that we'll have reliable service throughout this winter. We've also implemented some new ancillary services, a fast frequency response service that helps to ensure reliability and during operating conditions that change rapidly. And so when we look at the SARA report for this winter, there's really a lot of similarities in the big picture as to what we saw in last winter's SARA report. For all of the expected scenarios, we expect to have adequate supply to meet the needs of the grid. And so that continues to be the same situation this year as we saw last year. And for the majority of the scenarios that are in the more extreme condition scenarios, we still see adequate supply to meet the reliable operation requirements of the grid. The key changes between last year's and this year that I would call your attention to, one of the more significant ones is we see demand having grown. We see demand upwards of about 5 gigawatts or 5,000 megawatts more than we saw in last year's SARA report. And that's a result of the incredible growth that Texas is experiencing. Texas is adding a city the size of Corpus Christi every single year in population, and the associated economic growth that comes with that is driving increased usage on the grid. And so we see that reflected in the SARA report. We, for the first time, have included battery storage as an element, a resource that can help to provide reliable service during the winter. We saw the performance of batteries over the course of this last year, so we included a modest amount of batteries in the SARA resource list that reflected what the kind of performance we saw during some very extreme weather events over the course of this last year. So just under a gigawatt of battery storage is included on the supply side. And then fundamentally, the thermal resources, thermal generators, were relatively flat. from last year. So in spite of the increased growth on the demand side, we're seeing fairly flat amounts on the thermal generators. So that takes to the point where the elements that are outside of our control, which is what generation supplies get built and when, those elements, as well as how fast demand grows in the state, those elements also outside of our control, those have a pretty significant potential impact on the reliability of the grid, which is why it's so critically important that the work that we are pivoting to right now, which is to ensure that the phase 2 market redesign work proceeds rapidly and clearly with an understanding of everyone in the market and all the stakeholders, that becomes our focus going forward to mitigate the risks that exist in those most extreme of scenarios, which the SARA report currently shows is one of those scenarios that could occur. And so we really want to focus on making sure that we get that work proceeding quickly and address the benefits from there. But let me be clear that the actions that we've taken over this last year and a half position us as best as we have been to operate the grid reliably, and we expect through the forecast and the likely scenarios that we'll see over the course of this winter to be able to have enough supply to meet the reliability needs across the grid.
Thank you, Pablo. As always, we'll continue to operate the grid in the most reliable manner possible. We will continue reliable operations by having an expanded margin of safety with more reserves, and we will continue to bring more generators online sooner rather than later. In the past 18 months, because we've had these reforms in place, we have avoided emergency conditions or blackouts 8 times. We know the reforms are working. We've seen the results, and we're going to continue with those reforms and continue those reliable operations. As Pablo said, we have always known that we need a long-term solution because we have more and more people and the same amount of reliable dispatchable generation. And that's why we're so focused on continuing with the phase 2 market redesign. Thank you. Happy to take some questions. Yes, ma'am.
So there's still one emergency scenario that indicates a risk of load shedding under the extreme scenarios. Can you say what ERCOT and PUC are planning to do to address that particular shortfall?
So really the majority of the actions that we've taken over the course of this year and a half are designed specifically to address any risk of load shed. The most impactful of those being the weatherization work that's taking place. So a lot of the issues that we've talked about over the last year and a half about what happened during Uri was the unavailability of expected resources to provide generation during that storm. The weatherization work that's gone on was done successfully over the course of last winter. We inspected over 450 generating units since that time and are continuing to inspect units over the course of this winter. Those inspections and audits are showing that the work is getting done to keep those generators operating during the most extreme of weather conditions. So we really think that that's going to have the most significant impact to mitigate the potential for any kind of a load shed event. So that coupled with having the firm fuel supply, making sure that generators have been able to take their maintenance in a sequenced way that don't create new risk, and of course the reliable operations that we've been operating under on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, ensuring that before the grid gets too close to any kind of a reliability issue, that we would bring online supplemental resources to help support grid reliability. Those actions are things that we're going to continue to do to ensure that we don't get into a scenario where there could be load shed.
A quick follow-up to that, how many inspections of those generating units are still outstanding?
So we are scheduled to do, per the PUCT rule, about 1/3 of the generators each year. So we will do a little over 350 or so roughly each year as part of that inspection cycle. So we just launched that cycle a couple of weeks ago going into, and we do a good majority of those in December, and then we'll wrap up with those in the earliest part of next year. But we plan to get most of those done in the next 4 to 6 weeks.
So I'm looking at it, and forgive me if I'm misunderstanding this, but it looks like the reserve margin is about like 19,800-ish, 893 or something like that.
Which scenario?
This is just overall. This is the number that you all are comparing. I guess this is a question for ERCOT. It looks like the reserve margin is less than the reserve margin from last year, which was about 22,860.
Yeah,
Can
so.
you say like why our reserve margin is less when you're saying that the grid is more prepared this winter as opposed to last winter?
Yeah, and it actually highlights exactly what really is probably the most important issue to focus on today, which is how do we sustainably create a market redesign that is going to deliver the kind of reliability at the kind of cost profile that we all expect. So what's happening with this shrinking reserve margin is year to year we are developing more generation resources. The majority of those resources that are being added to the ERCOT grid tend to be renewable resources, like solar and wind. Solar being the largest portion of that coming online. During the winter, solar capacity doesn't have the ability to deliver to the degree that it can in the summer because of the nature of the weather and the sun performance. So the amount that gets added to the grid is not proportional to the amount that gets planned in terms of expected generation supply available. So that's one reason why. So the big majority of the resources being added are solar. You don't get the same value for solar in the winter. However, the demand is growing. A city the size of Corpus Christi, every single year, economy is growing, businesses are growing here, which is fantastic, but it does create more demand on the grid. And so that growth on demand, with not having the same amount of growth of dispatchable generation, so that's generation with an on-off switch, generation that you can call on whenever you need it, regardless of what the weather conditions are. We're not seeing the same amount of growth in that kind of generation as we are in renewables. That's the reason why that reserve margin is shrinking. That's the reason why this phase 2 market redesign is so critical to focus on and to get across the finish line.
Anyone else in the room? We can go to the phones. Moderator, are you there?
Yes, I am. If you'd like to ask a question on the phone, please press 1 then 0 on your touch-tone phone. You'll hear an acknowledgement that you've been placed into queue, and you can remove yourself from queue at any time by repeating the 1-0 command. If you're on a speakerphone, please pick up your handset before pressing the numbers. Once again, for any questions, please press 1 and then 0 at this time. One moment, please, for the first question.
And could you let them know to please identify themselves and the organization they represent?
Yes, thank you. One moment. We do have a few people queuing up. And our first question will come from the line of Bob Seckler. Please announce your affiliation.
Hi, I'm with the Austin American Statesman. Mr. Lake, you've expressed a lot of confidence in the past that there would not be, a forced power outages. And I'm just curious, are you as confident for this winter that there will not be?
Absolutely. I expect that we're going to continue to do what we've done the last summer, the last winter, and the summer before that. We've kept the lights on in the summer immediately following Uri. We kept the lights on last winter in the face of several winter blasts. And most importantly, this summer we kept the lights on in a record-setting summer, the hottest summer in Texas in recent memory, if not ever, where ERCOT set dozens and dozens of daily, weekly, seasonal records and 10-plus all-time records. So yes, we know that the reforms are working. We know that these changes have had an impact and improved reliability, and we expect they'll continue to do so.
So even though that one scenario was in there that could have power outages, you think people should sort of discount that and still be confident that there won't be any? I mean, that's in there, but you don't think it's going to happen.
Remember, this analysis is arithmetic, considering various different scenarios. We always will use every tool available, including calls for conservation. In addition, the basic arithmetic of adding and subtracting numbers doesn't account for the many reforms we've put in place, like better coordination and communication with the Railroad Commission, TxDOT, TCEQ, to make sure that roads are open to get fuel supplies and workers to generation, to better coordination on the natural gas supply chain to make sure that the key parts of that supply chain are online always, so that disruptions in the natural gas system don't lead to the outages that are contemplated in that scenario. While the arithmetic is a good exercise in examining various scenarios, it doesn't take into account the comprehensive reforms we've put in place that will make sure that this grid stays reliable.
And the lights will stay on?
Absolutely expect the lights to stay on.
Thank you.
And I think to add to that, I think it's an important point that scenario is a call out for the importance of making meaningful change through this next phase of the market redesign. And that's why I keep coming back to that, because while this risk continues to persist and the risk could continue to grow over time if we did nothing, I know that we're not going to do that, so we need to drive toward that change aggressively and with focus and clarity and support across the board so that we can make the kinds of changes so that everyone can continue to feel confident that the grid will be reliable and support their needs regardless of the weather outside.
Thank you. We'll go next to the line of, one moment, of Mose Boucle. Please announce your affiliation.
Hey, this is Mose with KUT 90.5. I guess my first question is, looking at the three different scenarios in the extreme risk scenarios, it seems to me that the most extreme, there's like a column, maybe, I'm curious why you don't include a column, a fourth column, to look at extreme peak load, extreme unplanned outages, and extreme low wind output. That's to say, you look at high peak load, but there's no extreme peak load coupled with the other kind of worst case scenarios. Why is that missing from the report?
At some point, you can consider an infinite combination of scenarios, but at some point, the productivity of considering those runs out. The column, the furthest to the right you're looking at there, considers 77,000 megawatts, over 77,000 megawatts of demand, and that's what the demand was expected to be during Uri. So, I mean, these are robust scenarios that take into account extreme circumstances, but there's limited usefulness in infinite speculation.
I'm also just kind of curious if this is just kind of a question of style, but last year we heard a lot about a conservative approach towards grid management. You seem to have dropped that terminology for the approach in favor of aggressive approach or reliable approach. Is there some reason to stop using the term conservative to refer to the management technique here, or is that still the word that you would choose?
It's the same technique, and really the shift in the word is to try to be more clear about what it is we're doing, and we're making sure that we put reliability at the forefront of everything that we do and how we operate the grid, and that's the main reason. Because conservative could be misconstrued to mean some other driver of why we're doing it, whereas reliable operations is really the focus. But it's the same actions and it's the same practices.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our next question will come from the line of Jeremy Rogalski. Please announce your affiliation.
Gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm with KHOU-TV, CBS in Houston. This is for Mr. Vegas. On page 4 of the SARA report with the 3 extreme risk scenarios, would you identify the third column as a Winter Storm Uri scenario?
It would look, so the third column where we have the high peak load and the extreme unplanned outages, extreme low wind output, would characterize some of the variables on the demand side, similar to what Uri would be. However, what's fundamentally different is the amount of outages that would be in place because of the kind of weatherization efforts that have taken place. And so there's some comparability to it in terms of the demand side, but the overall performance and the impacts of that, I think, would be very different than what we experienced during Uri.
So to follow up, is it safe to say or not safe to say that a Winter Storm Uri type of scenario would leave the grid in the red, specifically by 9,000 megawatts and change?
No, I don't think that would be a reasonable assumption, because a Winter Storm Uri type of event, which is a sustained low temperature storm, we could see an example of that in the first column, where we have an extreme, even more severe weather demand during a storm, which is at 80,000 megawatts, which if you look at, that's actually above even our peak in the summer. and we are a summer peaking state. So you could look at that scenario and say, okay, with a sustained long event at a very high level of demand and with expected renewable performance and typical unplanned outages, which based on the weatherization work that we've done, we would expect typical outages, that you would see performance continuing to support grid reliability in that scenario. So I don't think it's fair to say that the third column is a Uri-like scenario, because all three of them have characteristics of the Uri storm event, and the majority of them show that we would continue to be able to keep reliability on throughout.
Are there any other questions on the phone?
There are no further questions from the phones.
Anyone else here?
We do have, I'm sorry.
We'll take
We
one
have
in
a
the room and then
follow-up
go to
from
the
Bob
phone.
Seckler.
We'll take one in the room and then go to the phone.
Okay, thank you.
Part of the conversation around Winter Storm Uri was that the grid was previously prepared for the 2011 standards. Based on these new categories and the work that's been done to the redesign, are we prepared for another Uri, or are we prepared for a storm that's going to be 10 degrees colder than that one?
I expect to be prepared for both of those because of the comprehensive nature of all of these reforms and how they combine together to be greater than the sum of the parts. Not only do we have a winterized generation fleet now, which is a tremendous difference from both 2011 and Winter Storm Uri in 2021. That's an absolute game changer. We now have better coordination and mapping of the natural gas supply chain, so we expect that to work. This winter, we now actually have another 3,000 megawatts of fuel on site, physically on site of the generator. We've got better coordination with TxDOT so that the problems that previously were experienced in winter storms with access to natural gas facilities, access to generators, access to coal, can be mitigated by the TURC Council working in conjunction like we did last winter in the State Operations Center. So the comprehensive nature of these reforms and the fact that they encompass not just the grid but the natural gas industry, transportation, water, all combine to ensure that we're more reliable than ever going into this winter.
Moderator, we can take the phone question.
Okay, then we'll go back to the line of Bob Seckler.
Hey, thank you. Just two quick follow-ups. The first is this back in October, the federal agency released their assessment that kind of came to the same conclusion, that given in certain circumstances, severe circumstances, we could and would have not have enough power. So I just wanted to see if you thought of that as the same way you mentioned this one, and sort of that's just an arithmetic that doesn't take into account things like winterization, things like improved communication, and that type of thing. And the other question is sort of related, and that is, this will be the second report that says that we page through the report, and guess what? There's red there indicating not enough power. And it sounds like you think that the public should sort of just ignore that or discount that. And I'm just curious that there's that's not something they necessarily should be concerned about. And I'm just wondering how we should look at that, given that the reports seem to say one thing and you seem to say another.
I think actually I want that column to highlight for everybody the importance of the changes that are needed in the market design. You're bringing up a point that I think we're all very consistently trying to reflect as well, which is it is critically important to address the fact that there is a scenario where under the most extreme conditions there could be not enough power. That's not acceptable. We don't find that to be an acceptable circumstance, and that's why change is needed in the market design in order to address that. So we're not trying to underplay it at all. It does reflect a very low probability scenario, so we want to be clear on what it is. It is a low probability scenario, and so tying back to what you said about the NERC report, the NERC report said the same thing. It was a low probability scenario, and we believe that to be true. But the fact that it exists calls out an issue that needs to be addressed. an issue that needs to be addressed around the overall design of the market and being able to continue to build dispatchable generation to ensure there will always be enough power. And so we are emphasizing that. We want to call that out very clearly, and we agree 100% with the point that it is an important data point for everyone to understand, and that's why this work that we're embarking on is so important. And so back to your first question, the differences between the scenarios, the NERC report is really based on just one scenario. And so the fact that it shows a low probability likelihood of some kind of a load shed event, just like ours does, and there's some differences in the numbers, really is just a math exercise on the basic assumptions. But that the main points on both the NERC as well as our report is that under the majority of scenarios, we do expect reliable operations this winter. But again, not to underscore the importance of the fact that change is needed. And we're here to let people know that we know how important that is, and we're going to continue to drive that change until we see the results we want.
Anyone else on the phone?
Thank you.
Yes, we'll go next to the line of, we'll go back to the line of Mr. Boschel.
Hey, thanks so much for taking the follow-up. Obviously everyone's most concerned about the possibility of blackouts, but I was curious too to get some more information on the potential likelihood of conservation calls or energy emergency alerts. It looks like under most scenarios in the extreme assumptions category, that would be on the table. I guess I'd just like to get comment about that. Given extreme weather and some other sets of circumstances, we may expect that type of reaction, which is part of grid operations, I assume.
We'll continue to use every tool available to keep the lights on, including conservation alerts and the industrial demand response and our voltage support and every other resource we have to keep the lights on. And while this math exercise does show some scenarios that put us into emergency conditions, we have reforms and tools to mitigate the problems that that would be outlined here. So we expect we'll use the tools we need to, including conservation notices.
If either of you could also just explain a little bit more why the assessment chooses to not include unplanned outages during Uri in the thermal generating outage assumption, and maybe that was obviously a kind of a super extreme event of outages, but there was a decision made to not include that in the assumptions about where power plants might go dark in the course of this winter.
Sure, our power plants are winterized now. They have coordination with natural gas, so disruption of natural gas and freezing of the generators that was experienced during Uri and 2011 has been mitigated, and we saw the results of that last winter.
Okay. Last
Thank
question.
you.
Anybody have one more?
There are no further questions from the phones.
Again, for ERCOT maybe, is there a target amount of total resources you'd like to see, or target amount of thermal resources you'd like to see on the grid available by next winter?
The way we think about it more is really looking at overall loss of load events is the term that we use. And so we want to try to drive towards a very low likelihood of losing load at any point in time, whether it be winter, summer, or in between. And so that's really more the metric that was the basis for the E3 study that was done in the last couple of months, was defining, and they used a kind of an industry standard loss of load, which was 1 every 10 years, is something that has been used in other markets around the world. And so they used that to come up with the overall modeling that we saw in that assumption. And so we're really looking at it more through that lens and saying a particular number of megawatts from this source or from that source, because we really want to be more technology agnostic in how this market evolves and allow the market to evolve in a way that delivers the reliability outcomes that we're looking for. And those kinds of metrics drive to those reliability outcomes.
Right. I guess I'm asking that because you mentioned the solar resources that aren't as available in the winter as they are in the summer.
Yeah, that's an important point. We don't have a reliability standard now that would dictate a goal of how much reliable dispatchable generation we need. And we fully expect to keep the lights on like we have this winter, like we have in the past, but it's getting harder. We have more people in New Corpus Christi every year, and we have the same amount of reliable dispatchable resources with no target, no reliability standard, which is a key part of the Phase 2 reforms that this commission has evaluated and discussed and is taking public comment on now. And that's a goal we need to work towards. And because it's getting harder and harder to do this, because we have more people, the same amount of reliable resources, is why this Phase 2 market redesign is so important. This is a long-term problem of lack of a reliability standard, but the future's coming.
Thank you.
We do have another follow-up from the phone if you'd like to take it.
That's fine.
Back to the line of Mr. Michelle.
Hey there, sorry to keep popping back in. I had a question for Chairman Lake just about PUC operations. You mentioned not having a clear reliability standard. That was one thing that was highlighted in the Sunset staff report last week. Another thing that came up was just the number of staff at PUC. It recommended that you have to greatly increase your staff size. What are you thinking about in terms of preparing for winter and the staff size you have now, and how the agency might benefit from having a more better resources, I guess you could say?
This staff has done an incredible job in fulfilling the tasks they were assigned with after Winter Storm Uri by the legislature. It's a tremendous group of people, but we've been given a heavy burden, and yes, we need more staff. We need more resources. We still have a lot of work to do, and so I wholeheartedly agree. We need more great folks like the people we have here.
Thanks, Mose. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
No further questions from the phone.
Thank you.
Okie dokie, thank you. Thank you so much, Keely. I appreciate everything that you've done for today.